My brother has always wanted to prove that God doesn't exist. He could somehow enter into another dimension. I've done it, Michael, he triumphantly announced last night. He hadn't. As we would learn by the end of the evening, Jack had achieved quite the opposite. And for that, we would both pay. Come again? I asked, lifting my eyes from the phone screen. My brother sank deeply into his squeaking armchair, blank gaze fixed to the wall ahead, fixed to anything but me. His profile swam in a shallow pool of orange cast by the table lamp beside him. The lounge felt darker at that moment. It was only around 6 in the evening. Only minutes earlier, the lamp's glow had cut far more cleanly through the shadows of the room. The dark was taking the light. It was infesting the brightness and safety of the room with its ever-growing tendrils. Tendrils that were reaching towards us. These are observations that I have only digested upon reflection, as I was never one for magical thinking. Never one for spirits. Never one for religion. At the time, my rational mind simply compartmentalized my doubt, my thoughts on the living room's disjointed ambience. Instead, I let bemused thoughts reign in my mind. Jack, I pressed, failing to contain my laughter. Did you just say what I? Yes, he interrupted. You heard me correctly. I've proved that there is no God. I grinned. Which God? All of them, he replied. I always told my brother that I shared his belief. That I was too rational to believe in spiritual or religious concepts. However, he always asserted that this wasn't enough. In our youth, he once said, I'm not talking about belief. I'm talking about proof. There is no way of disproving God, I pointed out. Nobody's proved his existence, so how on earth would you disprove him? Most people plaster religion over their anxious wounds. It's a source of comfort for them. For Jack, it was always the opposite. He sought to disprove religions, all religions. To my brother, there was nothing more terrifying than the possibility of a deity, or multiple deities. There shouldn't exist anything that powerful, he said. Doesn't it scare you, Michael, the idea of something far greater than us? I shrugged. I just don't think you should waste your life on this. It's an obsession, Jack. At this point, in our teenage years, he'd already wasted 18 years on the pursuit, and I'd wasted 12 years listening to him prattle tirelessly about the subject. I truly believed this holy, or unholy, mission would plague him until his dying day. But then last night brought an unexpected development. My 38-year-old brother proclaimed that he had achieved something impossible, something no other human had achieved in all of recorded history. Now, Jack is an incredibly intelligent man. He works for the United Kingdom Space Agency. But he's hardly a once-in-a-generation genius. And neither am I, for that matter. I'm a biology lecturer. But we're both scientists. Both smart enough, I should say, to be skeptical about such a historical claim. Explain, I said. How have you proved that God doesn't exist, that no gods exist? Jack cast his eyes downwards, still not meeting my gaze, and replied, if you're expecting a 50-page thesis with tried and tested experiments, you'll be sorely disappointed. So if you haven't proved it with science, then what? I said. If you start preaching about the evidence of God and the majesty of nature, I'm going to mentally tune out, so, will you stop yapping? Asked Jack. I didn't say I hadn't proved it with science. There was a NASA mission last year. I was just made aware of it. And what I learned has changed everything. Everything I know to be true about the laws of physics. I was only made privy to a fraction of the data from the initial report, but it was enough to convince me. God isn't real. Well, you're only giving me a fraction of the story, I pointed out, a tad facetiously. Come on, Jack. Spit out whatever you're trying to say. There's an edge to our universe, my brother finally choked. And beyond that edge, there's nothing. They found nothing. That's what the official document says. They found a white abyss, like space inverted. And that's it. The end of all ends. We both sat in silence for a moment. A multitude of moments. After 3 decades of life, I know the difference between Jack's truths and lies, his sincerity and his humor. This was the former, not the latter. Are you sure you didn't misinterpret whatever you read? I asked. I'm sure, he quickly replied. I nodded. Well, you've mentioned before that you typically don't have the clearance to access full NASA documents. Important information will have been redacted. Information that might provide a clearer picture, perhaps? It doesn't matter, he said. It doesn't matter how much of it was redacted. I read enough to learn that there's nothing beyond our reality. No pearly gates. No creator watching us from above, below, or to the sides. This is an island floating in a wide abyss. That's the universe. Not an infinite plane, not a donut-shaped spiral, and not a large, planet-like sphere. It has boundaries. If you travel in any given direction fast enough, and far enough, you'll reach the end. You'll pass the end and enter that other place. A place that is nowhere and nothing. I shivered as the room started to blacken further. The table lamp's light wrestled failingly against the lounge's strengthening gloom. Again, with my logical brain at the wheel, I dismissed this. It was my stomach, actually, that sensed something was wrong, that started to gurgle. Its contents were whisked like a thick pool of batter. My body knew that something was wrong, but my mind denied it. Perhaps I've always been more like Jack than I wanted to believe. We both did our damnedest to believe in anything but God, any kind of higher power. Last night, however, I considered just the opposite. For the first time in my life, I was agnostic. What do you think? My brother eventually asked. I frowned. That you just divulged highly confidential information. Michael, he groaned. I don't know. I cried. I suppose I think that the idea of a finite universe with an edge, a bloody edge, is absolutely insane. And maybe NASA will eventually publish their research, confirming the evidence in the report. That would be a wondrous thing, but it still wouldn't prove that God isn't real, Jack. Nowhere in any religious text does it describe what those astronauts saw, said my brother. Then he reached into his briefcase and produced a hefty wad of documents. I'm going to post this entire thing online. Maybe somebody out there will be able to fill in the gaps. Tell us about the redacted information I haven't been permitted to access. There's a word for that, Mr. Snowden, I warned, raising a hand to signify that he should slow his roll. Just calm down. If you leak classified information, you'll face a whole heap of trouble. I don't work for the American government, Jack retorted, rising to his feet with the papers tightly held in his hands. The world needs to know. You're right, okay? Something important has been left out, and somebody out there will know what. And then we can all finally accept the truth. That humanity is alone. That there's no big, scary God watching over us. That we. With a shattering sound, the table light's bulb burst, spitting shards of glass against both the inside of the lampshade and the coffee table beneath. I clutched my pounding chest, trying to smile at the sudden startling moment, but I was focusing too heavily on the room's heavy darkness. Each thump of my heart was more urgent than the last. My body was screaming at me to pay attention, to do something. And the final part of my body to join my other fear-ridden organs was my brain. Something was happening. Something we couldn't explain with known science. It was only a blown bulb, any other rational person would say. But you weren't in that room. I knew it was an omen. Jack? I whispered, eyeing his silhouette poking above the headrest of the armchair. And then that shadow plummeted downwards, folded into itself, like loose clothing, and disappeared into the black outline of the chair. I screamed, leapt to my feet, and slipped my phone out of my pocket. When I illuminated the chair, however, I found it empty. My brother was gone. He had, impossibly, vanished into thin air within the space of a half-second. Quivering, I cast my phone's torch beam around the unlit room, and then I illuminated something odd. Beyond the lounge's doorway, in the lobby, there swung an open door which led into the cupboard beneath the stairs. Much like Jack's vanishing act, the door opening had happened of its own accord. I exited the living room, and my eyes twitched disbelievingly as I neared the tiny door. Inside what should have been a cupboard no more than 1 foot in breadth and depth, was a long hallway with mahogany walls. This impossible corridor had appeared beneath my brother's staircase, stretching far beyond the outer bounds of his house. Those wood-planked walls were plastered with sheets of paper, scribbled with writing that hurt my eyes to read. And leading along the tiled floor towards the door at the other end of the hallway was a trail of blood and flesh-covered bones, that induced a round of horrified vomiting. And when I lifted my teary eyes again, the room beneath the stairs had changed a second time. It had become a white abyss with a wooden desk in its center, the only furnishing in that nothingness. Atop that desk, rolling unsupported, was a small glass sphere, a crystal ball of sorts. Within the sphere was blackness painted with specks of burning color. Yellows and greens and blues. The world within the ball looked almost, to me, like the universe itself. A reality globe. Jack? I foolishly bellowed into the void. In response, the crystal ball began to roll. And when the globe toppled off the edge of the desk, the white room turned black, as if it had flicked a light switch off. One last time, I opened my mouth to call for Jack. But then came footsteps. Booming footsteps, reverberating off the walls of that infinite void. I was certain the place had no walls. Was certain that it had neither a floor nor a ceiling, and that the desk had simply been an illusion, like everything else in that place. The footsteps neared. The sounds of feet broad and imbued with divine rage. I knew it was no man, I knew it was angry, and I knew it was coming for me. Terrified, I slammed the cupboard door shut and tripped clumsily backwards. I slid against the wall to a sitting position on the lobby floor, then I wailed in terror as the steps beyond the door continued to loaden, and I closed my eyes. I prayed. To what? I don't know. Any and every deity that has ever existed. Then I heard the door fling open, and I squeezed my eyes more tightly together. But nothing came. And 10 or 20 minutes later, I opened my eyes. My brother's house was still black, so I lifted my phone and lit the open doorway beneath the stairs. The room had become a storage cupboard again. And Jack was nowhere to be seen. I have spent the last 24 hours hunting for him, but I know he disappeared in that hallway of blood and bones. I pray they weren't his. He left only the NASA report behind. Documents still lying on his living room carpet. Every time I look at them, my eyes hurt, glassy spheres that swim ferociously against the void of my sockets. It's a warning. We've taken the forbidden fruit, and my only hope is to not learn any more than I already know. If I read that full report and reveal it to the world, I will face the same fate as my brother, whatever fate that may have been. The same fate, I assume, that must have befallen those NASA researchers. Unless my brother's mistake was simply to threaten to share his knowledge with the world. Knowledge of a god, or a thing, that we are not supposed to see. In any case, I must accept that Jack isn't coming back. He met his end. An end worse than death, inflicted by something that may not have even been God. Not any God we know. Out of the corner of my eyes, I keep seeing shapes slinking out of view. Sometimes, it's a man. Tall, impossibly so. His limbs stretch out towards my frightened form. Other times, it is a flicker of festering light. Living light. It moves in an erratic way. It doesn't matter which shape presents itself because they're all illusions, physical manifestations designed purely to make sense to human eyes. For the true form of that thing, were I ever to see it, would drive me to insanity.